Thank you to our sponsor, Quantum Workplace. Quantum Workplace is a human resources technology provider that equips workplaces with the smartest talent solutions so that they can grow and succeed. Quantum Workplace has been a pioneer in the employment engagement and performance software market and has partnered with thousands of organizations to drive employee, team, and business success. I would now like to introduce your speakers for today, Josh Bersin, Global Industry Analysis, Sarah Waltman, VP, Global Talent Management and Organizational Development at Dentsply Sirona, and James Webb, VP, Global People Development Engagement and Communications at Fossil Group. Josh, you have the floor.
Welcome, everybody. Well, what we're going to talk about is a couple of things. We're going to talk about the SEC rules on human capital disclosures, which are a very interesting trend, but maybe the bigger issue is what you can and should do from two companies to deal with this change. And it really goes into the theme of data and measurement and analytics in general for HR, which is a big topic in general. So let me talk a little bit about the SEC rules. Around early 2020, I believe, or middle of 2020, the SEC, after many years of discussion, by the way, there are many white papers and research reports and meetings that have happened to prepare for this, essentially said that public companies are required to disclose human capital data. And so, unfortunately, the rules are very open. There really aren't any specific requirements. So what we did over the process of developing this white paper with Quantum Workplace, by the way, I want to thank Quantum Workplace, first of all, for raising the attention to this topic, because this is a really important topic for many reasons I'll explain. And we looked at a bunch of companies, and they're all different. Everybody's doing it in a different way. And if you look through some of the information that came from the Harvard research that they did on it, and this came from the Harvard Law Group, these companies are all looking at different topics. They can put culture metrics in their SEC filings. They can put metrics about governance and operations of the human capital function. DEI is very common. Rewards, learning, career growth, engagement metrics, and so forth. And we'll hear a little bit more about this from Fossil and Dentsply in a few minutes. And the reason this is so important is, and by the way, there's also different volumes. It's funny, Kathy Inderis, who's our head of research, looked around at these filings, and she found Tesla, which is obviously a company that everybody knows a lot about, had basically one paragraph. And it sort of said, we have this many people, and we're really into hiring people, and we take people seriously. And Ford had 3 pages of details on their turnover rates and how much they're spending and where their people are going and so forth. So you kind of have to think about it. Now, the context for the SEC rules, of course, are the business environment that we're living in. Let me talk about that, because I think that's one of the ways to think about this as a project for you that will really add value. We're in an economic growth cycle that has been going on for almost 13 years. I know it doesn't feel like that with the pandemic, but if you look at the stock market and you look at the economy, and by the way, I don't know if you saw the data, the U.S. economy is expected to grow by more than 7% this year, which is very, very high, and even the economy in China is growing at that rate. So we're dealing with a very disrupted and a really competitive labor market. It would not surprise me to see the unemployment rate drop to back down to 4% or lower, where it was right before the pandemic. There's no economic reason why that wouldn't happen. And of course, as you know, we are beginning to see inflation and interest rates going up, and wages as well. So companies are really dealing with this new issue, and employees are feeling very empowered. Now, this is an interesting statistic that you may have not paid attention to, but let me explain what it is. The Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out a report every month on the labor market and unemployment, and one of the things they look at is voluntary quit rate, which means the number of people who voluntarily decided to leave one job to get another job. And in April of this year, only a couple months ago, 4 million people voluntarily quit. That was 2.7% of the workforce, and it's the highest number they have ever seen in the history of these statistics. Now, that doesn't mean these people got laid off. That means these people feel that they could find better jobs elsewhere, or somebody was willing to pay them more per hour, or there was a more flexible opportunity across the street, or their old job opened up again and the temporary job they were taking they don't want to do anymore. So we're in a world now where these issues of hybrid work, getting feedback from employees on their work experience, dealing with DEI, paying people fairly, giving people career opportunities are basically business priorities. They're not just HR problems anymore, because most organizations are trying to grow to meet the needs of the growing economy. And the only way, in many cases, the only way you can grow is to hire more people. In fact, if you look at the issue of hybrid work, and we've done a bunch of research on this, most employees will tell you, and most studies have shown, that employees prefer hybrid work, and they will actually defer pay in exchange for more flexible work conditions. And so these are kinds of issues that require data and information for you to make decisions. Now, in addition to that, of course, we all learned a lot about well-being and humility and resilience and work-life balance and the importance of families during the pandemic. And of course, the pandemic's not over either. I mean, there's a lot of places where it's actually getting worse again. And what happened as a result of that is the vast majority of companies really started to rethink their leadership philosophies and their leadership, culture to focus much more on empathy and flexibility and resilience and patience in this environment. So getting back to human capital metrics for a minute, if you don't know who's leaving, who's not leaving, why people are unhappy, where parts of the workforce are under stress, you can't really react in this new cultural environment. I've been through 4 or 5 of these economic cycles, and usually during a growth cycle, companies push people to work harder to meet the demand for your products and services, and of course to keep ahead of competition. Well, that's not as easy to do when we're coming out of a pandemic, so we need data for that. In fact, just along that topic, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but this idea of redefining leadership around the human issues is really becoming a popular topic. It's not a new idea, but when Jeff Bezos becomes the chairman of Amazon and says, maybe we should become the #1 company focused on employees, not just customers, et cetera, this starts to ring true in every company you have. And if you look at these human-centered issues, this is basically, by the way, this is based on a research paper that's available on our website, that virtually every management issue, every business issue that you face is at its core a people issue. I know that sounds a little bit strange, but if you're not selling enough, or if your product isn't keeping up with the competition, or your service is behind, or your customers are unhappy, there is a human capital, driver behind that. So coming up with good metrics for human capital is a very, very important thing. It isn't just about HR. It isn't just about meeting the needs of the SEC. Interestingly, just on this topic of leadership, and I apologize for the slide, it got a little bit messed up, but one of the things we found in the last 12 to 18 months during the pandemic was a really interesting, creative, new way of thinking about leadership. And let me give you 2 examples. Lego, everybody knows Lego. Lego's business exploded in the last year. And we will hear a little bit, by the way, about Fossil and Dentsply, too, and how their businesses have responded. And, because people were home with their kids and the kids wanted toys, and so actually they had more than a 40% increase in revenue during the pandemic. And what they decided to do with their leadership is not just sort of push. is really take a step back and say, we want you to understand what it's like to be a consumer of our product. We want you to understand what it's like to play. So they built what they call a leadership playground for leaders to really understand what their customers are doing and the value they're delivering. Microsoft has done the same thing in a different fashion in really reinventing its culture around growth, energy, success, well-being, resilience, productivity. So this is, these are things that are easy to talk about, but there's metrics needed to do them well. And, as we go forward into the next couple of years and why the SEC rules are important, my sense as an analyst talking to many, many companies is that most organizations are becoming more and more like professional services companies in the sense that, people have rigid jobs and they have job titles and they have job roles and they have responsibilities, but they're not doing only that. They're doing other things. They're working on projects. They're assisting other people with new initiatives. Job roles in organizations are changing. So, there's a whole set of metrics on mobility that are also important. In fact, I would encourage you to think about mobility as as something to measure, because in a tight labor market like the one we're in now, what I'm seeing from the data from bigger companies is 30 to 40% of the hiring is internal. That's a big number. And most of us haven't optimized internal mobility nearly as much as we've tried to optimize, the external hiring part of the company. These are all companies I just happen to mention here as examples that are putting together very formal internal mobility programs called talent marketplaces. And they are measuring the sort of dynamism of these internal mobility projects, because they're beginning to see how much demand and sort of energy there is inside the company around people taking new roles. And that, is a big, big theme we can talk about during the Q&A. The other area of metrics that's very, very common, and you see it in a lot of the SEC reports, and we'll talk to the two panelists about this, is employee engagement. And employee engagement or retention is now called employee experience. And yesterday we launched a massive study that's available on our website. It's a beautiful new research report on this topic. And what we basically discovered is something that a lot of you probably know, is employee engagement is based on Maslow's hierarchy. At the bottom, if you're not safe, if you're not paid well, if you don't feel included, if your manager is not somebody you're getting along with, those are your issues. And then as you move up the hierarchy of needs, you become more interested in the things at the top. And this is by the way, this is what Quantum Workplace does, is help you assess this at different parts of the company. And you'll find in every company, some people are at the bottom and some people at the top, depending on their job role, how well they fit, their manager, their experience, their fit with the culture, and so forth. I think these are things that are very important to measure, because in terms of, what you measure, measuring retention rate is a great indicator of maybe the strength of your company, but it doesn't give you a lot of design help. It doesn't really teach you what's not working. And because where we really are now with this new kind of explosive economy is really in a design role where we're trying to design the hybrid work experience, the workplace, the technology, the culture, the pay, the benefits that will create success for individuals and for the company. Now, the reason I mention this is that a lot of the metrics that have come out of companies for many years come from the older model of industrial engineering or employee engagement. Our engagement metrics went up by 3% year over year. Our retention went up by 5% year over year. Those are, from an SEC or public reporting standpoint, great. But you know what you're going to do as soon as you put that on a piece of paper and you formalize that metric, somebody's going to say, what can we do to make that better? What are the reasons it's at this level? And so I think one of the discussions we'll have, with the panelists in a minute is how to use these human capital metrics for decision-making and design and improvement, not just for reporting. I mean, the reason the SEC thing is so good is it's going to force everybody to do a better job of reporting. But, the real issue in companies is that no single metric really covers everything that's going on. This is it's sort of a pictorial view of the employee experience problem from an HR standpoint. Every one of those little clouds is a whole set of issues that you're probably thinking about or have thought about at some point in time in your company's culture. And down at the bottom, and they go up Maslow's hierarchy on the left, and down at the bottom you see that they're really not owned by any one person. So your project to put together the human capital metrics is a huge opportunity for you to work with all these other teams and discuss what these metrics mean to the company relative to what other people are doing. I mean, one of the things that came up from the pandemic, most of you know this, is, the fact that, the HR department can't fix what's going on with work at home. If people are working home, it's an IT issue, it's a legal issue, it's a pay issue, it's a compliance issue, it's an HR issue, it's a management training issue, it's a management coaching issue, there's well-being issues that belong in the benefits department. All these things are now interconnected. And, the reason I'm bringing this up is as soon as you start building metrics, you suddenly see, well, this number, might be useful, but what do we, where does it come from and what do we do with it? The other thing that I want to highlight in terms of human capital metrics is employee feedback. Kathy Enderis is on the phone. She just appeared. Thank you, Kathy, who actually did a lot of the work with Quantum and the clients here. And I'll let her talk a little bit about this in a minute. One of the things we have studied, Kathy leads research for us, is in this research, in the research we just did on EX that was launched yesterday, and the research we did on DEI, and the research we did on business response to the pandemic, one thing came out as the biggest driver of success. And it wasn't pay, and it wasn't training, it was feedback, it was listening. It was your ability as a company to hear and make sense and act on the information coming from employees. So again, going back to the theme of the webinar, as you get involved in the metrics that you're going to publicly report, you're going to open this Pandora's box of incoming information from employees. And, thanks to the tech industry and companies like Quantum, you can get this information very, very quickly and you can act on it. And it's not just information on retention, it's information on the company. One of the clients we worked with a lot over the last couple of years is an electric utility, and let me just mention their story. They have very, very strong regulatory environment, and they have to report all sorts of things on accidents and, hiring rates and pay and so forth. They had a big fire a couple of years ago, and it was a pretty big disaster. And, actually some people were killed, and there were lots of, lawsuits. They went back, some people went back and looked at some of the data that they had been collecting and not paying attention to prior to the accident. And it turned out employees were complaining about the maintenance process and the relative repair of these different parts of the pipeline. And of course, there's also legal issues in having that data. But, if they had been able to take advantage of that faster, they probably would have avoided that problem. So this is a big part of metrics too, and lots of things have happened. One more point on this whole topic. Kathy just completed this study of employee experience. In fact, Kathy, I'm going to ask, is your voice working?
I think it is.
Oh,
Can
great.
you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let me take a minute, and I want to introduce Kathy before we go back to the panel. We just looked at employee experience and employee issues among 80 or 90 practices, and just published a study. And we found that amongst all these things, there were a few that were very, very outperformers in terms of, impact on the business. And so, Kathy, can you take a minute and just tell people a few minutes about your findings from this?
Yeah, sure. When we looked at employee experience overall, we studied all these practices on this table, and in fact, we looked at, I think, 83 organizational practices and strategies, from how you structure work to management behaviors and how the workplace is set up, health and well-being, how employees grow and people can grow, and then trust in the organization, and then a bunch of technologies. And what we found there is that it's not so much the management behaviors, it's not so much about technologies, although they all play a role. It's not so much how much well-being support you give people and like de-stressing tools. And somebody said to us, after I work 60 hours, I don't want to go to a yoga class again because I'm already overwhelmed, right? Just leave me alone, those kind of things. It's also not so much about learning, and all of those things play a role, but what really plays an outsized role on the employee experience is how the culture of the organization, the trust in leadership, the trust in and transparency that the organizational leaders inspire for their people, how transparent they are, how inclusive your work environment is set up, and the psychological safety of the environment as well. So I think all of these points probably resonate with all of you as well, and with Sarah and James as well, as we're talking about how you were thinking about structuring your human capital disclosures as well, and what story you want to tell about the work environment you're creating for your employees. And so that's how this connects with this bigger picture of employee experience as well, because I think one strategic question that I heard when I talked with Sarah and James about their human capital disclosures was, what's the story you want to tell about your people, right? What you pick as part of your metrics actually really matters, because, and Sarah said that to us when we talked about this, is what the metrics that you highlight shows that you care for these metrics, right? So if you talk about engagement, it actually shows that you really care about engagement. If you talk about inclusion, it really shows that you care about inclusion. So the messages we sent with these disclosures actually make a big difference in how employees see the organization as well. And I think, James, you shared with us that it really elevated all the great work you were already doing. People might not know about them, right? Your employees might not know about them because they don't see them all in one page, right? So this is how all of this comes together.
Thank you, Kathy. We'll talk to James and Sarah in a minute. The other thing I just wanted to highlight, this is another piece of research we just published yesterday, that it's interesting, there's a pretty big distribution of companies in their sophistication in dealing with employee issues. And this is, in the research that Kathy just finished publishing, but roughly a little more than half are kind of, I wouldn't say applying Band-Aids, but maybe just patching the boat all the time, as opposed to getting ahead of where the boat's trying to go. So these stories that you tell with the metrics are really, in fact, I was just thinking of something, Kathy, based on what you just said. The fact that Tesla only has 2 sentences about their human capital strategy and Ford has 3 pages, what does that tell you? What's the story behind that?
Exactly. I mean, it's exactly. I don't think we have to say a lot about that. Exactly right. Just right. When you show at the sheer volume of, do you just capture it because you have to, right? It's the bare minimum. You just have to say how many employees you have. True, right? So, or are you really diving deeper and share a holistic story on how you care for your people and how important they are for your business? That's exactly.
Okay. So anyway, this is EX. You guys can find a lot more on this on our website and also from Quantum Workplace. So let's just talk a little bit more about the SEC issue, and then we'll open up the Q&A and the discussion. The SEC is a government body, and they're unfortunately required to satisfy many, many different stakeholders in the United States. And so what happened in this process, I know some people that were involved in the initial, is there were some very, very specific interests who said you need to have diversity metrics, you need to have retention metrics, you need to have learning metrics, you need to have career metrics. And the pushback, of course, from many, many other companies was, we don't measure that, or we're not running our company that way? Or what does that have to do with my company when I don't care about that stuff and I'm doing fine? So what they ended up with is something fairly simple. An open invitation to do whatever you want. So what we've discovered, and Kathy has discovered as well, is that companies are selecting what they want to do. Now, my personal opinion, and I want to hear from James and Sarah also, is that this is an opportunity for you to put together the story you want investors and external stakeholders to hear. These SEC documents are very, very widely read. They're read by financial analysts. They're read by, industry analysts. They're read sometimes by employees, sometimes by job candidates, by people around the world that are looking at different industries. And so in some sense, this is a very big, interesting opportunity you have to put together something that will brand your company. In fact, I think one of the things that's interesting about the process is going through this, you will have to engage with multiple business leaders on what metrics we're going to disclose. That in and of itself is actually a very valuable exercise. You're going to be asking yourself, what do our competitors do? Who are the competitors we want to compare ourselves against? Are there really difficult to compete with companies that have metrics out there that we don't want to put our metrics against? What is the story we're trying to tell? And how are we going to defend these metrics when somebody from the financial community or maybe somebody inside the company says, well, I don't understand that number. Where did it come from? Why is it what it is? So in some sense, this is a massive accountability project, an alignment project inside of your company. I just one more point on this, and then I'll start doing Q&A. Kathy and I have both worked together a long time, and one of the things we've looked at for years is this thing called people analytics. People analytics used to be called HR analytics, and it was probably called something else before that. And it's been about capturing and cleaning up the data about people and using it. And most companies found that cleaning it up was a big problem. There wasn't a good definition of turnover. There's all sorts of different sources of data. There's 5 different payroll systems, 14 different learning systems, 32 different, systems for part-time work or scheduling work. So most of the, effort in people analytics has been about integrating, defining, cleaning, and coming up with standard metrics that people can agree upon, and then sharing that information inside the company, forget about the SEC, so that the stakeholders inside the company, including the business partners and the business leaders, can rely on the data and we can talk about it and we don't have different numbers. Then using the data to predict things. Oh, well, we found out that the sales productivity in this part of the company is low, so is the retention. Oh, well, we also have young managers. Where'd those managers come from? We all hired them from this other company. Well, maybe we should stop hiring people from that company, or maybe we should start hiring people at that age. I mean, all of those things have been going on in companies for the last decade, and this is another step in that journey. So anyway, that's enough on that. Let's talk to James and Sarah, and I want to, and Kathy too, because we have everybody here now. So let me start with you, James. Tell us a little bit about the company first, and then your journey of the SEC disclosure and what was the story you were trying to tell.
Sure. Thanks, Josh. So first of all, with Fossil Group, so we are a watch and accessory maker, a global company that's based out of Richardson, Texas, with manufacturing stores and sales offices all around the world in the United States, Americas, EMEA, and APAC, and make a lot of the brands specifically for watches that everybody's familiar with. So not just Fossil, but also names like Michael Kors, Kate Spade, Tory Burch, Diesel, and about 10 others. So really engaged in the fashion accessory business. But for us, we're a real humble company, and so we believe that we should do a lot of the things we do around people because it's the right thing to do. And we've always taken the approach that you do it because it's right, not to get accolades necessarily externally or to toot your own horn. And so for us, we definitely wanted to be authentic about the message that we shared with folks. But for us, it was really a big unlock because while we always paid attention to the employee experience, culture, performance, et cetera, what it really allowed us to do was it allowed us to turn over some rocks that we hadn't turned over before. It really allowed us to start to understand the why behind some of the numbers, as you mentioned earlier, and to have that conversation in a much more deeper, rich way across the organization. And as we had it, what was really important to us was to really determine what would our stakeholders, from employees to shareholders and investors, what would be really important to them so they could evaluate really the quality of Fossil Group compared to, as you mentioned, competitors and others. I think if you really believe, which we do, that employees are the most important asset a company has, how could anybody really evaluate the long-term growth and possibility of an organization without being able to see this large chunk of valuable information? And for us, that was what was really key to the story.
Great. Okay, that's fantastic, James. So, let me turn it over to you, Sarah. Tell us a little bit about your company. I'm afraid to pronounce it because I'll probably pronounce it wrong.
So Dentsply Sirona. In 2016, we merged Dentsply and Sirona. Yes, a little complicated or a tongue twister, no pun intended with the dental side. We are the world's largest manufacturer of professional dental solutions. Just in short, we help people smile. And having a company that does that is so attractive to begin with. And then we know when we have that big of a draw for what we do for our customers and our communities, we have to follow that up by having an amazing employee experience. So I really liked what Kathy said, the word of the irresistible. So our entire strategy has really been in talent management and working with a broader group in our council around what we're going to report is really working backwards from that. So we know we want to be irresistible. We want to work backwards, and there may be blind spots, but looking at those blind spots as, wow, what an incredible opportunity that we recognize this, and then figuring out how are we going to solution around that so we can get where we know would be an organization that helps people do their best and perform at their best. So at Dentsply Sirona, we create and help people smile, and this is an incredible opportunity for us. And like James said, we have a lot of information inside. I would say one of the challenges as we go into the next part of the conversation is definitely how do you almost put that into a reoccurring report that comes out. That seems like you could just pull it out each month and it's got everything you need, and then you can just disperse it accordingly, either internal or external. That's maybe not the case. So that becomes the more challenging part, is how do you tell that story?
Well, let me ask you guys a question, sort of getting into that. How did you decide what metrics to disclose? James, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we looked, the Harvard Law article that you referred to earlier, Josh, was obviously a starting point for us. As you said, some folks have been doing this for many years in different ways, but never to this level of intensity, or it went from one paragraph to three. And so in doing the research, we found about 70 different parent topics that you could report on. And then underneath those, anywhere from, 3 to 6 key metrics. So you're talking hundreds of possibilities. And so similar to what Sarah said, was we really backed into what was important for you to know as a stakeholder about our business, for you to be able to make important decisions for you. So for an example, what would we want a future candidate to know? What would we want a current employee to know, and why? And more importantly, and less about what we would want them to know, but we really framed it from their perspective as what would they want to know to make a decision to stay or come here. And then we did the same thing for our investors, our shareholders, and really asked the question, if you were going to invest in this organization and you had the financial numbers, what other questions would you have about the people side of the business that would allow you to make good, solid, long-term decisions? And from there, we really narrowed it down to the key items that we reported on. And a big part of that is almost, it really starts to become part of your employee branding. As Sarah mentioned earlier, it starts to be what you're known for and what you want to be known for and what you're going to continue to invest in and fuel as you move forward as an organization.
What were some of the areas you found that you felt were really important at the end of that process?
For us, they were, 5 or 6 key items. So diversity, obviously, very important for us. As I said, authenticity and allowing each person really valuing how you show up and who you are when you show up is one of our actual core values and has been for over 30 years. So with that in mind, really diversity and inclusion is at the heart of those actual items we reported. So was employee experience, which we included things around the employee voice, engagement and performance, health and well-being, and really the benefits we offered, how we were working to upskill our workforce, and how we were trying to make investments in our people to position the company as we really pivoted toward more of a digital organization versus just a traditional retail wholesale organization. And then finally, the last 2 big ones for us was really talking about the values and purpose of the organization holistically, and then rounding that out with really some ESG metrics, since the part of the people has always been important to us, but also the environment in the community, in our opinion, are a critical part of why we even exist as a company, is to do right by those 2, different areas. Wow,
that's a pretty extensive set of metrics.
Was better than 70, but
wow. Sarah, so tell us how you decided and what you ended up kind of focusing on.
Very similar to what James said, so I'll just add 2 quick additions for us. We realized, especially through COVID, that voice of the employee, so our listening strategy was so important. And we realized that things had wildly changed for what an employee needs from even a year ago. And so we realized that we needed to map out what the employee experience or desired employee experience was. And it's a very agile document, but we needed to really look there. That's when we began working with Quantum to make sure that we're looking at those milestones, measuring them, and then reacting quickly. And that's why I like some of the flexibility of the current disclosure rules, because it may change at some point. It evolves what employees need. We've seen that over the last year, 18 months. The other area is, one thing that came out of that is we realized that it was time to revisit our culture. So our vision, mission, values, operating principles, and just in the last couple months, our CEO did amazing work around rallying the organization to kind of write that in conjunction with the employees for where we are today and what we need for our future focus. And so I thought that was just a great element that came out of this entire process. Is we learned from our employees that was great on our journey then, and now we needed to revisit for what we wanted to do in the future and have the employees be part of that. So everything that James said, and really doing that around what we want for our employee experience.
Wow. So the metrics sort of projects led to a discussion of culture, and it led to the CEO being involved in just Sarah, on that question of CEO-driven culture, tell us a little bit about what the new manifesto is. What's different about it?
Can't completely release it yet, but I think what is just really different about it, and as we're still putting the polishing on it to go on as part of our brand, what's really different about it is this one wasn't written in a room with a consulting company or our CEO and a couple of people. It was done as an organization. We had listening tours. We took data that we had captured via different surveys, engagement survey work we had done, onboarding, offboarding, et cetera. And we brought that all together. And then we got into almost one of the value of teams is just all the countries coming together, all the different parts of the workforce, and going into breakout sessions and really shaping it together. So what's the most different about our culture now is it was created with and for the employees.
In a global, integrated way.
Absolutely.
Kathy, let me ask you a question. So one of the parts of doing this is getting the data and not only agreeing on what data, but getting it and making sense of it. You've been involved in data projects and analytics in a lot of companies, including here. What are some of the problems companies typically face in getting this data, and what would you recommend they do?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, I think, a lot of aspirations on what data to include, and then you hit the reality of what you can actually get, and reliably so, because as you said before, and everybody said before, is you got to make it, then it's going to be discoverable, and then you got to be able to defend it, right? So if you say it's kind of correct, but we don't quite know, that's not good enough for these disclosures. It might be okay with maybe seeing some trends and all of that, but once you put them out there, you got to be able to stand behind that. And that's, the bigger the company, the bigger the problem there, and the more global the company, of course, the bigger the problem there. For example, and Sarah mentioned that too when we talked, as a global company, it's very hard to report, almost not possible to report, for example, on diversity metrics that go beyond gender diversity, because in Europe, you can't ask people some of these questions for data privacy reasons and all of that. So you got to always look at, can we even get the data, even if we wanted to? Is it possible to get the data? Can we get it reliably? Can we get it repeatably? Can we defend it? Can we track it? And all of these things are then the realities that hit you. And then you might say, well, some of them we can't actually get full data, so we might just talk about trends rather than data, because these measures that you include, some of them are quantitative, but some of them are more qualitative. You might say we are working very hard on these kind of initiatives to get traction on that, rather than saying here's our progress. Because once you put a number out there, you got to really stand behind that and make sure that you can defend that full.
So it's not as easy as it looks.
It's not easy as it looks. And Sarah, you mentioned some of these issues, of course, too, right? On data, like how easy it is to get the data. Also on learning data, for example. You mentioned too, Josh, before, like the learning data, if you have learning metrics that you have in 15 different systems or something, well, can you really compare them? Are they tracking it the same way? Do you have different business units that maybe define even retention, for example, in different ways? When I was with Kaiser Permanente, we had between different business units and different groups, they defined retention of employees differently, even within our organization, right? So just consolidating that within your organization is much more challenging than it might look on the outside.
Anything you guys, Sarah or James, you want to share on any tricks you picked up on how to get the data clearly? And then I want to ask you one more kind of big question also.
Yeah, I think Kathy's points are spot on. I think you have to determine what you're going to report and kind of lock that down. So then if you need to determine any new systems, new processes you need to put in place, or if you're only going to be able to report on a segregated part of the business, you have to kind of have that in place. What I will say somewhat informally, I think as a good addition to reporting is to have real stories. I think it is extremely helpful if in the context of your report, or if it's almost like in an article format, is you have a story of where that affected someone personally and how they have grown with the organization, or they feel included because of your employee resource groups. And I think some of that brings it to life. And even though that might not be evidence that would be accepted in an audit, when you're looking at your employee group, your investors and others, I think that's a really compelling way to kind of tell the data story.
Yes.
James, go ahead.
Thanks. And for us, it was, I think that's where the balance comes in, and it's really important between the, qualitative and quantitative, because you don't want to just report a bunch of numbers. You really want to give people a flavor of who you are. And I don't think you can do that, to Sarah's point, without some of that storytelling in there as well. The other thing we did from a best practice standpoint is, you pull a lot of numbers when you're in HR throughout the years. As you said, this has been going on forever. What you can be bad about sometimes is going, now, how did we do that again? And what was our starting point? And so, it seems hard enough in the moment. It's always even worse the following year when you try to figure out what you were thinking. So we were really diligent this time about documenting, and this goes a little bit to Kathy's point. When we say retention, what does that mean? What was the groups? When we say, diversity and inclusion, and we talk about BIPOC, what did they? So we really documented and defined everything we reported on. So it'll be hopefully a little easier next year, because I can't lose any more hair. So I have nothing to spare if it's not. So we tried to simplify the process as much as we could to make it repeatable.
So this sounds like it's been a very healthy exercise for both of you guys.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of questions on the bigger picture around this. Let me ask you, I would like all three of you to give your opinion. Theoretically, the benefit of this is that there's more transparency and to some degree value and competition in human capital metrics. And, one of the people asked, will we ever treat employees as an asset, not an expense on the balance sheet? Which I doubt it, but maybe. But you can still run the company that way. What is your belief or sort of experience so far on the positives that might come out of this for your company or for other companies in your industry in general? And I don't know who wants to answer that first. Sarah, do you want to try first?
Absolutely. I think when we have more discipline around data, the utopia state would be that we're actually using it to tell how we're improving and driving performance. I think that's somewhat the utopia, and we rarely get there. And I think that's what organizations should strive for, and us as HR professionals is all the other things are great. And yes, we do still have that responsibility to make that connection between the human and the actual output or the performance. And so I think just not losing sight of that with how we're reporting and making sure that we are having that as the end goal is that we're showing the driving of performance.
Great.
And for us, I think it's a couple of things. One is it definitely is richer dialogue, right? And so, and I think that what's really important about that is not just talking about it, because we've always talked about it, but I think it's really, as you mentioned earlier, it's having the conversation and say, here's what it is, but what's really driving that? What's really, whether it's a good thing or it's an opportunity, what's causing that to have the outcome that we're seeing, and how do we either, highlight that and leverage it even more, or how do we go in and talk to employees and adjust that or address that? So I think that's one thing that we've seen come out of this is just much richer dialogue and diving into more of the root cause and then maximizing that. I think the second thing that I'm hoping comes out of this is, we talked about a cost versus an investment. Well, if you can't show return, it's always a cost. So if we have any hope of us saying that it's an investment, you have to show a benefit and a result that's positive. And I think this is a step that starts to say, out of all this work, effort, and money we're putting into this important thing, important part of the business, what are we getting from it, and how is that better positioning us in the marketplace for the long term and against our competitors? And I think this is the first step to start to really unlock looking at it that way from a business perspective, internally and externally.
Kathy, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I just add another piece to circle back on the employee experience kind of map where we said trust is most important. I think this is a really great opportunity to inspire trust of the employees in the organization, because if you're transparent about how you treat people as an investment, how you invest in the growth and the development, in the performance of your people, if you communicate that to your employees, not just to your investors, but also to your employees, as Sarah and you both told me that you do that as well. I think it's a really great opportunity to see that as this kind of trust-inspiring opportunity as well.
Great. Well, I think it's interesting, but all of you guys are so positive on this. What's your reaction when you read a disclosure like Tesla where there's one sentence? Do you think I'm just curious. I think when we start looking through these SEC disclosures, we're going to see, really innovative, creative, forward-thinking companies, and then we're going to see other things. Does it have any impact, or do you think this is just a little sideline? Kathy, you look like you have something you want to say.
Yeah, I have a lot of passion around that, so I can go first. I think companies like Tesla, they think they can buy their way into getting the best people, right, and inspiring people to do their great work. And I think that goes maybe some way to maybe attract people, but we don't wake up every day and look at our paycheck and say, this is why I love my work, right? This is not what inspires us to do our best work. I think it might get you in the door of getting great people to come in, but it's not going to go all the way to help people do their best and be their best. So I think it shows the kind of culture that the organization has. If you talk like Ford, for example, or if you talk like Tesla, and I think we saw.
Well, I just reminded of something, you guys. You may not be aware of this. One of the financial analysts that I talked with over the years, and this has become more common, uses Glassdoor ratings to evaluate financial performance, because they know that the Glassdoor rating is an indicator of health or lack of health of the people systems inside of the company. So maybe this will be another step towards allowing financial analysts to dig in more, because they don't know. They don't really know what's going on inside the company when they recommend a stock.
Yeah. I think it's a great thought, actually, because I think the way these human capital disclosures are written will probably be predictors of future performance, right? Because you can't be a good company or a great company without really investing in your people all the time.
Okay, well, one more. We have like a few more minutes. There aren't a lot of questions. If you guys out there there's 200 people online. If you guys have any questions, just fire them in. I guess the way we have. Let me just wrap up and ask, James, you and Sarah, is there any one thing that was surprising in this exercise that you would warn people about, or just share, that turned out to be either harder or more or different than you had expected?
I would say it is, why I think we're all very positive about it. It is extremely time consuming to take this on. And, we probably underestimated a little bit of how long it would take. And so, we increased the amount of time we put into it because you had to post by a certain date. So I would tell people to definitely allow a good amount of time to go in and actually lay out the plan before you start trying to collect the data, have some conversations about what's important to your organization, various stakeholders, et cetera. In hindsight,
so it doesn't turn into a massive 2-year project.
Exactly. Or a crazy 8-week project with hundreds of hours, right?
Yeah.
Either one.
Great. Sarah, is there anything that was surprising to you that you want to share?
Yeah, I think understanding that the report is just not externally facing, but something you really want to socialize internally. And if you don't do that, it's a massive missed opportunity to share with employees. Sometimes I think it's easy to assume that everybody knows that, hey, this is the performance management process we have in place, or, we got this tool for learning. And some of those messages don't cascade through the organization. So thinking about, as you're going through it, what's going to be the way that you communicate and cascade what you're presenting externally or to your board of directors, so on and so forth, also to your employees, so that they have that knowledge as well.
Great. So remember that the employees are a big audience for this too.
Yeah, I think this also goes back to one of the questions that I see in the chat, in the Q&A here. Why would privately held companies engage in these practices? And I think it has to do with your employee value proposition, but also engagement of your people and just bringing above the line all the great things that you do to invest in your people. And I know I heard this from both you and you, Sarah, and James when we talked, right? So how you message all of these things to your employees as well, how you reuse them maybe on your website and for candidates and for your employees as well, I think is really key as well.
I think it'll become increasingly important to be able to articulate the employee value proposition when you're sourcing candidates. So to get ahead of that and have that story is another potential opportunity.
Well, let me just wrap up. I have a couple. There was one question on how you find this information. It's pretty easy to go to Google and type SEC disclosure and then the company name, and you'll usually just pop right up, and you can look under the human capital, and usually you'll get right to the right page. I'll give you my observation. When I first heard about this SEC rule, I was not very excited about it because it was so vague. But actually what I'm realizing and learning from you guys and from Quantum is actually it's really good, because this is forcing every company to exercise this muscle between HR, the CEO, finance, and decide, A, what data do we care about? B, how do we get that data? Where is it? How do we clean it up? C, how do we tell the story around that data? And what are we going to do about that data? Because our employees are going to see it and our investors are going to see it, and all of our outside stakeholders, including our customers, are going to see it. So now I'm realizing that this is really very much like generally accepted accounting practices where, I'm sure there was a day when there aren't any and everybody just ran their company however they wanted and half of the companies weren't making any money and they didn't know why. This is the beginning of us taking the human capital business not just seriously, but really sort of with numbers and putting numbers behind people. So I'll tell you, I've learned a big lesson from you guys hearing this. So I would encourage all of the people on this call to, engage with your top execs, your finance and business leaders, and work on this and look at it as an ongoing process. And that's certainly what I've learned from you guys. So I want to thank you for sharing all this. Any closing thoughts? James, I'll let you go first.
I'd just like to say thanks very much for having us and for having the conversation today. And to, in addition to yourself, thanks to Sarah and Kathy for allowing me to panel with you guys and girls.
Well, thank you for sharing what you've been working on. It sounds great. It makes me want to go buy a new watch, actually. Sarah?
I'm sure I'm not, I hope I'm inspiring everyone to want to go to the dentist. I am just so thankful to have had the opportunity to be on the call. I've followed you, Josh, for several years and actually started my career using one of your maps and used that kind of as my starting point part. And so to be able to be at this moment is just a tremendous opportunity for me.
Well, and thank you. I mean, I think what you're doing is amazing too. We'll spend a little more time talking to you about it because it sounds fantastic. Kathy, you did a lot of this research, so how do you feel about all this topic?
Yeah, I was really, really excited to tap into this topic in a little bit more detail and get under the cover. So I learned a lot also from talking with Sarah and James and Quantum on how to approach this as a strategic opportunities. Because in the beginning, I was a little bit like what you just said, Josh. I'm like, well, what's really behind that? And it seems more like an administrative exercise, but it's not at all, right? It's really a big moment for HR and the people investment to shine. So,
well, and let me thank Quantum Workplace too for raising this issue. We could have done a webinar on how great their tools are, but they decided to take it up a level, and this is a really important topic. So, Luke and the team at Quantum, thank you for really bringing this topic to everybody. Okay, I think that's the end. Luke, did you want to do a little close?
Yes, thank you, Josh and Kathy. Really appreciate the research that you guys have done, and then Sarah and James, the case studies. And this last slide here shows that at quantumworkplace.com/HRE, you can get copies of the research and a checklist on best practice metrics to include in your filing, but also you can get the case studies from both Fossil Group and Dentsply Sirona. And so we encourage you to go check that out, and we'll also be emailing that out to all attendees today. So thank you, Josh, thank you, Kathy, and thank you, James and Sarah, and we really appreciate this research and what we can do to help drive just that critical time for HR leaders to really drive HR metrics and how they impact the overall organizational performance.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.